Welcome to the third session of the Just Zero Conference, an international event focusing on the role of finance in the just transition to net zero. My name is Nick Robbins, Professor in Practice for Sustainable Finance at the London School of Economics, the Grantham Research Institute. The event, Just Zero, is being organised by the Grantham Research Institute along with the Initiative for Responsible Investment, the Centre for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School, the Principles of Responsible Investment and the International Trade Union Confederation. And other partners include CDC, the Institute for Human Rights and Business, the Power and Past Coal Alliance. And with COP26 starting in less than a week in Glasgow, this session will focus on perhaps where the issue of the just transition is most important, the needs and opportunities in emerging and developing economies, where investment requirements are greatest and many development needs still have to be met in terms of poverty elimination, inequality reduction, and livelihood development. We will focus on the role that public and private finance can play in delivering a just transition in these countries, and we'll focus particularly on two major economies, South Africa and India, and bring in the experience of leading development finance institutions and how they are now taking action on just transition. To do this, we're delighted to have six great speakers. We have Dipak Patel, who is head of the Climate Finance and Innovation at the Presidential Climate Commission in South Africa. Welcome, Dipak. We also have Saul Levin, who is the Executive Director of Trade and Industrial Policy Studies, think tank TIPS, also from South Africa. Great to have you, Saul. We have Jayant Sinha, Member of Parliament from India, and we also have Prasad, Modak, Executive President of EMC, also from India. Delighted to have Mafalda Duarte, who's the CEO of the Climate Investment Funds. Welcome, Mafalda. And finally, last but not least, we have Amal-Lee Amin, who is the Director of Climate Change at CDC. So we will hear individually from Dipak and Saul, from Jayant and Prasad, and then Mafalda and Amal-Lee in turn. And then there will be a chance for you to ask your questions. Please use the Q&A function for that, and I'll try and take as many as possible. And the session is being recorded, so we hope to make that available quite soon so you can listen back and share that with your colleagues. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to Dipak Patel from South Africa. Really, Dipak, to draw out some of the key priorities for South Africa in terms of your efforts to deliver climate action through a just transition, and particularly where you think financial innovations are most needed to deliver this. So Dipak, over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Good morning for those viewers who have joined from the United States, and of course, good afternoon and good evening from those who are further east in Europe, in our case, Africa, and then of course, India. Nick, thank you very much for providing this platform where a combination of developing countries in the form of South Africa and India are being given an opportunity in some ways to explain what their path to a net zero future in 2050 might look like. Having said that, I also observed some of your sessions yesterday, wherein panelists spoke about developed country pathways. And what was quite heartening is that without fail, almost every single one of them indicated that this being a call for global unity means that we have to look across national boundaries and in fact come to the party, so to speak, as one and all. And for that reason, I think all of us, without being cliched, understand that this COP26 is going to be absolutely critical. Are we going to put our money where our mouths are? Are we going to somehow find a way of delivering what has not been possible to deliver for whatever reason since 2016 and the promises that were made there? And will we catch up? Because we know that a maximum rise of 2 degrees Celsius, which was the commitment originally made, is no longer a desirable option. And in fact, we have to show much greater levels of ambition, which leads me then to the South African story, if I may, and indicate that the Presidential Climate Commission was formed as a commission by the president in December last year. It still derives a mandate from his office as a commission. However, there is an intention to give it statutory power through what is going to be called the Climate Act. It is currently the Climate Change Bill, which has passed through our cabinet and has now entered the parliamentary system, and soon, we hope, will come into law, giving expression not only to the powers of the Presidential Climate Commission, but in fact, committing the country through a number of pathways to a set of climate outcomes that are contained most recently in our second NDC. Now, viewers will know NDC is Nationally Determined Contribution. I'm a newcomer to this world, so that I've recently learned this jargon. However, our NDC presupposes a number of things. Our NDC has an upper bound and a lower bound, but for the first time, it also is graduated and progressive. Graduated and progressive in the sense that we've set our eyes on targets, upper and more ambitious lower bands to 2025, as well as 2030, understanding full well that the road to 2050 is a very long one. And unless we plan for it in a systematic and progressive manner, in all likelihood, we'll miss that target too. Having said that, we know that South Africa, like a number of developing countries, has challenges. Its primary challenge, and Saul will go into some of this detail, no doubt, relates to both our Gini coefficient, which at almost 0.7 is one of the highest in the world. And this belies or underlies the reality that we are considered to be a middle-income country in the sense that the majority of population is in fact far, given our inequality and our historical reasons for that inequality, the majority of our population is in fact nowhere near middle income. We have a rate of unemployment which is rapidly approaching 40. It's about 36%, and the primary, the main bulk of that unemployed is in fact younger people. Having said that, the Presidential Climate Commission's mandate is to seek a social coalition, and it is to seek a social unity amongst all the partners in South Africa as we undertake this compulsory journey to a net zero future in 2050, but while we do that, to ensure that we carry everyone along with us, firstly, but secondly, that we improve our own economic and prosperity amongst our people as we undertake this journey to a greener future. And I think that that's absolutely imperative. It goes to the heart of why there is this apparent contradiction between developed and developing countries with respect to what is the role of the developed world to not just assist, but in fact make a contribution to our collective well-being through a range of financial measures and instruments, which I will come to in a second. As it relates to our nationally determined contribution, the early stages of that have been relatively well mapped out. As early stages in modeling is easier to map. And it does rely, or in fact have dependency on a number of trajectories. The first trajectory is clearly the decarbonization of our electricity sector, which is very, very important to us in the early term. That followed by a retooling of our motor manufacturing sector so that electric vehicles becomes the manufactured base of that industry. The motor vehicle industry is not only a domestic industry in South Africa, it brings in a lot of foreign exchange. And in fact, the largest number of European and Japanese manufacturers in South Africa have dedicated facilities for export production. So when we talk about EVs in South Africa, it's not that we want just our local population to move to EVs, but we want to develop an industrial capacity to make the move towards the manufacture of electric vehicles. Finally, I think our manufacturing, mining, and our petrochem sector also has a very high reliance, either through electricity or directly on coal for its manufacturing process and therefore contribution to jobs and GDP. We do have early stage plans to move to a hydrogen economy. And this also, we will see a little later and hopefully in the discussion, requires investment. And the kind of investment that will require also requires then creativity and the ability of all capital providers to start thinking differently. Finally, I think I want to say that as we approach COP26, we are heartened that the majority of developed countries, and you will have seen the statement made by the Canadian minister yesterday or the day before, that there is a recognition that for one reason or the other, the commitments that were made have not materialized. As we move to COP26, I think it's going to be absolutely imperative for us to understand that we're in this boat together, that there are a number of dependencies that will be required to be fulfilled prior to a proper kickstart to a greening process, in particular in the developing world. In our case, a move away from carbon in the form of coal being the primary energy source for the bulk of our generation is a very clear first step. However, that comes with quite dramatic and drastic negative outcomes for a number of people, particularly in the Mpumalanga province in South Africa, and more particularly amongst the communities that have become reliant not only on the coal value chain, but in fact on the power stations that sit on top of these coal mines. Finally, of course, there's the SMME value chain that has developed over many decades in support of both generation and mining. And this also needs to undertake a path of transformation. So where are the possible uses of funds? Where are the possible sources of funds?
1 minute, please, Dipak.
I'm glad that Mafalda is on this call, and I'm so happy that at the intersessional meeting a few weeks ago, they did make a decision to consider the investment proposals for 4 countries. Having said that, I would encourage the climate investment funds to look at this in a progressive manner. I would recommend that we look at how the climate investment funds, how the CDC, how other donor countries can begin to use their base level grant and concessional financing to begin to leverage up in a number of different categories, which covers, in fact, the social costs that are associated, in our case, with a decarbonization that results in the coal value chain being disrupted and halted. In the case of technology, as you know, South Africa has quite technological advanced prowess, how to make sure that early stage technology can be funded through the learning curve and through the risk curve and into project and other types of finance. I think if we use the concessional and grant financing as a base from which to leverage up various other types of capital allocations that are needed, we will be able to provide the kind of momentum that we need in the early stages of undertaking this path to net zero in 2050. Thank you very much, Nick.
Thanks, Dipak, for laying that all out. Very, very good, and very good to have that strategic view. Saul, if I could turn to you at tips, particularly sort of to build on that, and particularly to think of some of the work you've been doing, particularly where the financing strategies and different types of financing approaches come in. So, Saul, please, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nick. And I think Dipak has laid out the challenges that we're facing and the decarbonisation impacts on communities, workers and businesses. So what we've been doing over the past year is trying to better understand where are the financing challenges to support the move away from decarbonisation, but also diversification of the economies that are by and large mono economies dependent on those coal mines and coal-fired power stations. So our work has been focused on that. And so what we've done is developed some analysis of what type of projects are on the ground and possibilities to move away to different types of industries. And we've come up with 4 different clusters of projects, ranging from low investment requirements to higher investment requirements on the one side, and those that what we call have low just transition ambitions. So they might employ few people and they might have less impact, but are often very key to unlocking smaller projects. So you might find some projects with high investment rates. They're open as the gateway to other investment opportunities on the ground because they provide a feedstock or some input into other processes. We then have a number of projects that are on the ground. They're low amounts, less than 20 million rand, so it's not huge amounts. And then we've got some what we call what would be the sweet spot of successful just transition impacts and have high ticket prices in terms of the pricing or the rand amount that is being sought. And those often are in a slightly different space. So we've got a research paper on our website, which if anyone's interested can get more information on it. And we also have a more dedicated piece of work on that. So, I mean, some of the gaps that we've been thinking about in terms of the financing of just transition projects and this economic diversification is these big and risky projects that I spoke about are required, but they need the financial support. Their existing financial ecosystem may not be keen to financing them, to provide financing them for them, because they're in a space where it's new technology, particularly for South Africa. It might be different ownership models, and it might be different approaches. On the small ticket prices, the banking system in South Africa isn't quite in that space where they're looking at that. They've tried it in the past. It hasn't always been successful. So there's less appetite to explore those low cost projects. And often we find that the costs of evaluating and doing the feasibility of those projects may in fact be more than the amount of the loan. So it does require a different approach to how we understand funding those type of projects, and also requires what we see as a different approach to de-risking projects, looking at some of blended financial products that might be available, particularly bringing in incentive or grant finance. And some of the de-risking measures, on loan term, quasi-debt with different repayment terms, maybe even some concessional debt with low interest rates. South African interest rates are fairly high at the moment. And so lower interest rates would be a major concession and important for this type of diversification. And other types of risk buy down support. So you might see a challenge fund being set up that can come in where you've got grant matched with loan finance or investor finance. And we've had quite a lot of success on challenge funds in South Africa. We've got a jobs fund where it was piloted probably over a decade ago, and they've had a lot of successes on that, crowding in private sector investment with some state investments. Things like guarantee funds, first loss provisions or debt instruments, or creation of risk pooling facilities are other opportunities that could emerge in response to some of these challenges, and are much needed. What we do need is a different approach, and we were on a call about 2 or 3 weeks ago with a bank in the Netherlands that's dedicated to financing the green economy space. And their approach is to get in early. That they even propose ideas to companies and take forward an investable approach that they become part of the solution rather than reactive and waiting for the projects to approach them for financing. So a different methodology from finance institutions are going to become quite important in this space. We also see some gaps in the early stage financing. We don't have a lot of venture capital funding in South Africa. There's a fairly robust private equity market, but it hasn't quite translated into venture capital. And typically what we see with some of these just transition investments is there's new technology involved. So we are looking at what are the opportunities to bring in a different finance approach. And there are some conversations that are ongoing, but these things start becoming important. And then our last gap, I think, and we see some of the needs here in how reporting is done. So what we have is the ESG reporting, and can that be strengthened? But also things around, what are the incentives in finance institutional companies to support a just transition? So how do we take that? What is our risk analysis approach? So these are some of the important things that we've been looking at, and some of the industry regulatory measures. So what are our corporate governance codes? In South Africa, we hold quite closely to the King codes of corporate governance. Can those be strengthened to make sure that it's not just about climate, it's also about a just transition in supporting those that are impacted by the decarbonization plans? Let me end there. I've got lots more to say, but I'll stop there for now. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Saul. That's a lot of detail, I think, actually sort of drilling down from, I think, what Dipak was talking about, the strategic picture to actually particular financial instruments. Really, really good to hear. We're going to move across the Indian Ocean to India. Jayant, you're a MP, member of Parliament, I think, for a constituency which is based on around coal. You've been actually one of the leaders in proposing India to take a sort of progressive approach, I think, ambitious approach to net zero. And also, if you have a background in finance itself, it'd be really good to hear from you about how you see the just transition agenda fitting now in India's sort of climate context, and particularly where you think the finance sector, both public and private, needs to play a role. So, Jayant, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick, and greetings to everyone. India, of course, is participating in COP26 in Glasgow. Our Honorable Prime Minister will be there, and we expect a significant step up to our nationally determined contributions. We had already announced in Paris, I think, some ambitious goals. Unlike most other G20 countries, we have actually overachieved on those goals, and we have delivered more than we had committed. And we are going to step those up again at COP26. Now, all that being said, the reality, of course, is that India is one of the largest emitters of carbon and carbon equivalents in the world. We are at 3.5 billion tons out of 55 billion tons globally. And because our GDP is growing strongly and will continue to grow, and as Nick pointed out, India, of course, is a large coal producer, and I represent a coal-bearing area. We are very significant users of coal. We have very large coal reserves as well. And because our GDP continues to grow strongly and hopefully will continue to do so over the next few decades, we are likely, despite our overachievement on the Paris commitments and our stepped up commitments in Glasgow, we are likely under the current baseline pathway to continue to grow our carbon emissions. And most of the modeling, and I say this as someone who professionally was an energy modeler themselves, is likely to continue to see an upward trajectory of emissions. And some of the modeling is showing that we will be at 7.5 billion tons by 2050, even with stepped up contributions at Glasgow. So, for example, one of the targets that is likely to be announced at Glasgow for India is going to be 450 gigawatts of renewable energy. And that sounds like a very, very ambitious, and it is a very ambitious target. But that has to be put in context because by 2050, we are likely to be requiring 2,000 gigawatts of installed capacity. So even as we step up by 2030 renewables, coal is not going away. Coal is going to continue to be part of the baseload mix and is going to obviously result in very significant carbon emissions as a result of that. And with GDP growing and electric vehicles coming in, but not for a full transition, we are likely, at the current modeling is showing that the trajectory, rather than flattening or coming down, actually continues to grow straight up. And we are going to go from 3.5 billion to 7.5 billion or so. So that obviously requires a different approach. Even this very ambitious set of targets that we are likely to outline is not going to enable us to flatten the curve or even bring us anywhere close to net zero by mid-century. Again, that's in the context of China announcing 2060 and Indonesia considering 2060 as well for a net zero target. So we have to take a different approach, and I have been among the people who's been advocating that we should bring in a law. And in fact, I have introduced in Parliament a private member's bill, which is modeled after the New Zealand law, to get us to net zero. And some of the scenario evaluation that I have been doing with expert modeling groups around the world suggest that net zero will be net positive for India. So net zero will be net positive for India. And we are going to see very positive impacts if we change the trajectory. Instead of being at 7.5 billion tons by 2050, 2060, instead, if we get to net zero by mid-century, 2050, 2060, we will in fact show very positive impacts. And these will be in terms of GDP growth. This will be in terms of jobs, and this will be in terms of lives saved, because air pollution, as you know, is a huge problem in India. We have lost some 450,000 people tragically to COVID. but we are losing 2 to 2.5 million people a year because of air pollution in India. We have a terrible, terrible air pollution problem, and 60 to 70% of it is caused by fossil fuels, particularly the use of diesels, fuels for transportation in India. So if we can get to net zero and end the use of fossil fuels, it'll have a very, very positive impact on India's economy and on India's health. Now, the catch, and as we all know, there's always a catch. The catch here is that we are going to require trillions of dollars of investments over the next 30 years to transform exactly as Dipak was laying out for South Africa, the Indian economy, which will mean that we will have to convert all of our electricity system to renewables. So 100% renewables rather than 40 or 50% renewables, which is the baseline case. We will have to completely move to EVs, which again is not a mandate right now. We are going to transform our industrial sector. We have a very large steel industry. We have a large cement industry. We have a large fertilizer industry and petrochemicals as well. All of these are going to have to move to hydrogen, which seems to be the most viable alternative right now. And along with that, we are going to have to change our entire building stock so that it is far more efficient, is using heat pumps and other sources of energy as well. Now, the one sector that is going to be quite difficult to change, and in all of our scenarios, we've largely left it untouched, is agriculture. Out of India's 3.5 billion tons of carbon emissions, 1 billion tons comes actually from agriculture. And this is hard to address because it's so distributed and there are so many different sources as well. And we've got the largest animal herds in the world in India as far as cattle and goat is concerned. So that's going to be a difficult area for us to go after. But you know, outside of that, I think we can get to net zero, and it will in fact be net positive for India. So where are those trillions of dollars going to come from? They're not going to come from the $100 billion Green Climate Fund. That's frankly, as a finance guy, I can tell you is pocket change. Yes, it can help in terms of blended capital and guarantees and reducing, certain interest rates, etc. The real money is going to have to come from the markets. It's going to have to come from investment dollars. And we have to figure out, and we don't have those institutional arrangements today that would result in privileged or concessional capital flows into our developing country economies and enable them to make those trillions of dollars of investment. So that's a very big puzzle. It's one that I'm working on with many other leading thinkers in the financial sector as to how we can direct these capital flows to the developing world to ensure that, in fact, we can make this great transformation. But the answers are not clear yet right now. It's going, like I said, it's going to require trillions of dollars over the next 30 years or so. I'll conclude by talking about, in fact, the just transition and the human impact of switching to net zero. Now, there is a very large coal belt that stretches across central India, from West Bengal into Jharkhand, which is where I'm from, into Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, and parts of Maharashtra. There are millions of people involved in the coal economy, directly, indirectly, legally, illegally. All of them are involved in the coal economy. In my own constituency, where I represent 3.5 million people, about a third of the population is involved in the coal economy. And unless we start the transition process now, unless we are able to provide them adequate livelihoods outside of the coal economy, and unless we start preparing them for this great transition that's going to happen, we are not going to be able to pull this off. I will repeat, if we don't start the transition now, we are not going to be able to make this happen, because we still have a chance of doing it, which is we should not start any more coal-fired power plants. We should not open any more coal mines. We should not allow any more hiring in the coal economy. If we retire what we have right now, retire our coal plants, our coal mines, and the people who are working there, in the next 30, 40 years, we can pull it off without any great human cost. But the longer we allow this to continue, the longer this lingers on, the longer we postpone the inevitable decisions we have to make, the more difficult, arduous, and challenging this transition is going to be. So I have made it very clear what I think, and I continue to speak on many panels and write extensively about this very, very challenging transition that we all face. As Dipak correctly pointed out, we're all in the same boat. We all have to pull our weight. We all have to make sure we can do this. But this is, an unprecedented global transition that we have to find appropriate governance arrangements and capital mechanisms to take us through. And sadly, I will say I'm 58 years old. I have two boys, one of them is 30. And I see this as the great challenge and task of our generation to enable this transformation to happen. But sadly, I will say that the COVID pandemic and other such crises are telling us that, frankly, globally, we are doing a very poor job of addressing these kinds of global challenges. So I think we have no choice. We have to do this, but we have to also be very mindful of what challenges and the lack of urgency and the lack of understanding that we are confronting right now relative to not necessarily net zero, because I think there's been good modeling on some of that, but understanding the human costs of this transition and how important it is to prepare people now and get going on it now. Thank you very much.
That was fantastic. I think really good setting out that strategic perspective, net zero, net positive, but then I think very powerfully the human dimension and the need to tackle it now. So thank you so much for that. Prasad, I'd like to turn to you now, particularly thinking about what you and others in the project, the Just Transition Financial Roadmaps project, which is working with CDC, what we've been finding in terms of some of the sort of financing arrangements and approaches and challenges to respond to that strategic context that Jayant has set out so eloquently. Prasad, over to you.
Sure, Nick. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I think, Jayant, you really set the stage. And I think the most important point I take from your talk is the timing, the urgency that we better start working right now. And we just can't delay our responses to just transition. But let me expand, Nick, stage a bit in terms of the canvas, because we've been discussing coal. And yes, coal is an issue, and rightly so, because there's a huge employment currently there. And the coal economy itself, is touching lives of millions of people. But let's also remember that we have other sectors. One of them, Jayant talked about, was agriculture. But we also have transport automobile sector, which is also going to be hit as we transit to use of electric vehicles. And the entire ecosystem dependent on the automobile end of life in particular, in India, for example, is informal and small businesses. And they are not going to get the vehicles anymore with internal combustion engines. And that transition is going rapidly so in India already. So we got to also pay attention to those who are actually in the ecosystem of automobile end of life. And just like you have a coal, we also have places where much of the end-of-life vehicle processing happens. And these are pretty large clusters located in other states of the country, apart from those which Jayant talked about from the coal perspective. So we got to expand to look at, even when it comes to place-based consideration, you have a different proposition coming in when we touch upon the automobile sector. And the third sector, which Jayant mentioned, agriculture, I think is also extremely important, because you would see in India, for example, we are running today 5 projects on climate resilient agriculture. These are all supported by the DFIs, engaged with different states. And we do expect in that smart or climate responsive agriculture, a change in the value chain. And I think that's, again, a crucial in terms of not just its GHG emission contribution, but the sheer size of the rural population engaged with agricultural activities. So that's a third sector. But interestingly, there is a significant spillovers between the sectors. So it's not a siloed approach that we look at coal and we look at, transport or automobiles or agriculture. They're all having significant spillovers into other cross-sectors. So that then takes us the story that if we were to look at just transition related responses, they will have to be regional. They will have to look at regional development over a long term. It has to be that strategy and not just look at only the issues related to just transition. I think that is, according to me, an important part where we look at little macro level, that we will look at just transition. Then I would say, Nick, as an opportunity, that how can we bring in a climate sensitive modernization of what we do. And I think that gives a very different roadmap for the development. While on one side, we are aggressively as a country moving to the NDCs and going beyond, we got to figure out how do we mainstream just transition consideration. Now, if you look at last two waves that we saw, the economic meltdown and the green economy campaign, and the page where we got different agents, UN agencies coming and working together, and now the COVID response recovery plans, which are also there in place. I think there's a lot to learn in terms of those transitions and the kind of pandemic related responses had to be given when we formulate strategies, for just transition. So let's look at how the role at that time was played by financing institutions. When it comes to the point I was making, that the entry level at the project may not be effective, then we got to look at the instruments DFIs have, or MDBs as well, is using development policy finance and DPFs. Over the last 10 years, India has received 10 DPFs already. And the recent one, which was jointly done between AIIB and the World Bank, is on social protection, signed in August 2021. I would house many of the considerations on just finance at that level of instruments like the DPF, which really brings in partnership. And also, I would go further, that when we have a long-term country partnership programs, and that is where we got to infuse our thinking, national level and the partners on just transition collectively. I think that may be the strategy. Because if you want to bring it at the safeguard level, and incidentally, as you know, many of these institutions like ADB or AIB just came out with their ESF, and ADB is upgrading their safeguard policies. I still feel that may not be the right entry point. And we got to, as I said earlier, go more programmatic. Now, that's where the interesting part comes, that many of the development financing institutions are routing more through what we call the category FI, or financing intermediaries. And that's easier way to do processing in terms of, putting the funds. But that I would call is an important role the DFIs may do, apart from participation. I would call this as a push strategy, that they should influence these financing intermediaries to be sensitive to just transition. And that's also a weak point, that many of the operations evaluations have shown that there are issues even for the FI to be responsive fully to the requirements coming from the DFIs. But that is something which we got to look. I want to end also in terms of the mainstreaming argument here, Nick, is, we talked about category FI, but I see a huge role of commercial banks, and there we have to see a role played by the Indian Banking Association, IBA, and of course the Reserve Bank of India, to come up with something where there is a financing institute. Commercial banks in particular, their lending operations are sensitive, and there is also a growth of informal lending now started in India. Where you bring in finance without collaterals. We are working with some of these commercial banks, and I find that exciting. So waking up also the commercial banks and the financing intermediaries, DFIs will have a good role to play. But I also see a great opportunity of mainstreaming in several of the mission mode projects in India to reflect on just transition. Even if you take just the Ministry of Skills.
1 minute, Prasad, please.
Even if you take a case of Ministry of skilling and entrepreneurship, and the huge canvas they have under the National Skill Development Council, I think we probably don't have to reinvent, but strengthen and partner. and build upon what is already on the agenda of that ministry, which intimately links to providing transitional skills to people. I think that's very, very crucial. And we should look at that and how do we mainstream some of the ongoing initiatives here. So I would put to summarize here that while we talk about financing, we need to create a demand for financing. That's very important. I mean, you may have schemes, but then you need people asking for it, for which they must build their skills. And because we're talking about value chain impacts, let's not limit only to the people individually getting affected, but the whole value chain and the small businesses. And let's open up to that level. And therefore, as I said, I will argue then, if taken up in the right spirit and timing right now, just transition-related responses can be a great opportunity for a country like India. So I'll stop here, Nick. Happy to take questions later.
Thanks so much, Prasad. So we've seen the strategic and sort of financing dimensions of both South Africa and India. Something shared, something's very different, obviously. Mafalda, I would like to move to you at the Climate Investment Fund, CEO there. Obviously a major institution for providing support to developing countries on climate. It'd be really good to see how you view just transition in the work you're doing, and particularly if there are sort of particular approaches, particular mechanisms that you're now starting to develop to address some of these challenges we've heard from the previous speakers. So Mafalda, please, over to you.
Thank you, Nick, for having us, and already a really fascinating set of interventions from colleagues here that could lead to really sound discussion. But let me start first trying to address your questions. So first of all, let me say that the way we understand just transition and the implications of just transition, we look at this not just from the perspective of jobs. And I think it's really important to look at this from an economy-wide and multi-sectoral perspective and approach. And very much, we are quite focused on driving and understanding that achieving this just transition will really depend on the opportunities and costs, and how these opportunities and costs of decarbonization will be distributed between different people and regions. And also it's our strong view that success in achieving these low carbon transitions will be quite determined by how inclusive this decision-making is, the decision-making processes, and also the extent to which equity concerns are addressed in what is done. And so just to illustrate this point, I mean, as a matter of fact, tomorrow we will be releasing a new study as part of our Just Transition initiative, and I'll mention it in a minute, which is focused on the specific cases of Mpumalanga in South Africa and Jharkhand in India. And so just to illustrate that a focus just on the coal workers oversimplifies the issue, and we need a lot more comprehensive approaches to just transition. In India, and according to our study, which, as I said, will be available as of tomorrow, in Jharkhand, there are around 1 million people working across the coal supply chain, but several million informal coal miners who actually scavenge coal from these abandoned coal mines for domestic use or selling it in the open market. But there are around 150,000 coal industry pensioners who are actually being partly paid out by the current workers. So which means that any coal contraction could really impact these present and future pensions and pensioners. Also, what these analyses have shown, which is known to our colleagues, of course, in this panel, but it might not be well known to the broader public, and we want to raise this type of awareness more broadly, is that the coal sector actually provides direct revenues to the national and the local governments. And we know that the local governments are the ones in many parts of the world that provide critical social services to the communities. Also, the coal companies themselves invest locally in infrastructure and make other types of investments that are important. In the case of Jharkhand in India as well, our work has demonstrated that the nationwide impacts, for example, through Indian Railways. Indian Railways conducts 8 billion passenger trips a year and gets 40% of its freight revenue from coal. And it uses this to cross-subsidize passenger fares. So we see already here the potential nationwide impact. If we go to Mpumalanga in South Africa, it is the same thing. So this narrow focus on jobs of the coal workers, we need to pay attention to those, certainly, absolutely, but we need to take a much broader approach because the direct jobs in Mpumalanga are around 10%. 10% of the direct jobs in the province are in the coal, direct jobs in the coal sector, but with the indirect jobs, this number goes up to 30%. And moreover, Dipak was talking about SMEs. 50% of the businesses offer services to these industries in the region, according to the analysis. So clearly, and as most of you know, if not all, we at the Climate Investment Funds have been quite focused on climate investments for more than 10 years. We have a large portfolio of projects in 72 developing countries, more than 300 in a variety of sectors. And we were established with a strong mandate to learn and be a sort of like a learning laboratory on climate finance. So a couple of years ago, what we decided to do was to really drill down on just transition. And we established this Just Transition initiative. And through the work we've been doing through that initiative, it's been quite clear to us. I mean, we've worked in case studies, dedicated case studies. This is the latest one that is going to come out. We are also undertaking other case studies beyond the energy sector, because I think at the point that Prasad made, that is not just about the energy sector, it's not just about the coal sector. So we are conducting studies as well in other sectors of the economy. But you know, really we worked on a framework on how to think about just transition in terms of investments when it comes to climate finance. And we have found that climate finance can actually play quite a critical role in supporting just transition, not just in terms of grant funding for upstream just transition planning. So, you know, work like modeling of national and regional transition scenarios, building on that dialogue platforms, cross-departmental platforms for collaboration, skills mapping, skills needs assessment. So there's a whole variety of work that should be financed and can be financed out of grant funding, but then also concessional finance in terms of the large scale investments. And there's a need for demonstration what this could look like, what these investments need to look like, different approaches, different models, different structures, different financial mechanisms. So all of this needs to be financed because we need demonstration. We also need the communities, the regions, the authorities, the private sector, all of the stakeholders to start seeing, you know, how one can go about this. So from that perspective, and I'm going to conclude before you tell me that I'm running out of my allotted time. Because of that, and this work that we've been doing for 2 years, we now have embedded all of this just transition principles in the new investment programs. That 2 of which we are launching at COP, one on accelerating coal transition, of which India and South Africa will be amongst the first countries to benefit from the program, but also in the other programs that we expect to launch next year. And you know, how do we see that in our coal transition, accelerating coal transition program, new program, is because we have been very explicit in structuring that investment program that we need to see a comprehensive strategic investment plan we will support the countries in coming up with this, and some are more advanced than others in their thinking, in their analysis, in their consultation processes, but we will be supporting them coming up with this strategic investment plan that contemplates investments at the governance level, at the people and communities level, and at the asset or infrastructure level. So we want to see this more comprehensive, holistic approach. And I certainly agree with also with Jayant that the sooner we start seeing investments in just transition, to also build the confidence of the communities that the authorities and the different stakeholders are really, placing them at the center of this transition, the better. So I certainly agree that maybe, in certain groups and within certain institutions, that there is too much of a focus or an imbalanced focus on the electricity sector vis-a-vis. I mean, I think we need to bring these communities together, these experts, these institutions together, and really tackle this in a much more comprehensive way. I could say a lot more, but I'm hoping that some of the. I also want to tell Dipak that I took his point on us being progressive. I mean, I think we are being progressive in a sense that we have put out this first of its kind investment program, accelerating co-transition program. That was something that isn't out there in the development community or the climate finance community. Mm-hmm. And we have put it out with this, with this holistic approach and really indicating that there has to be quite a lot of focus on just transition. But you're right that, what we will be doing in South Africa, hopefully, is enabling many others to come in. And in India, the same thing. We want our capital to be enablers of a much larger volume of investments from others, because that's what our capital is for. It's to be risk-patient, concessional capital that others are not. And we hope that this is a first phase and that we can scale up this engagement in the near future. So Nick, let me stop here.
Fantastic, and really good to see this just transition concept come to life in your mechanisms, and looking forward to the announcements you mentioned at COP. So Amal-Lee, Amin, thank you for joining, and also it's been great to partner with you at CDC on the Just Transition Finance Romance projects in both India and South Africa. And it's really striking for me seeing how Just Transition is one of the 3 pillars of CDC's climate policy. It'd be really good to sort of hear from you about that, I suppose, how this sort of concept is drilled down into the operations of CDC and where you see the sort of greatest needs and any sort of interesting examples to actually make, I think, as Mafalda was saying, the sort of demonstration of this. So this important imperative comes to life. So Amal-Lee, over to you, please.
Great. Thank you very much, Nick. It's great to be here and great to be having this discussion with partners in India and South Africa, and of course with the climate investment funds. And I think, really indication of how this agenda is maturing, how we are all collectively seeing the importance of bringing together the social economic aspects of a net zero, and also importantly climate resilient transitions as we think about the climate finance agenda in particular. So as you said, Nick, CDC, we have we launched a new climate change strategy last July, and focusing on the just transition and how through our investments we can help contribute towards a just transition for workers and communities is one of the key pillars of our strategy. The other 2 being to be net zero by 2050 at the portfolio level, but also ensure every investment is consistent with that and consistent with the Paris Agreement, as well as how we can invest more in adaptation and resilience, both the resiliency of our investments, as well as to invest in businesses and those solutions that can bring adaptation resiliency services to all relevant sectors and communities. So the way in which we've been developing our implementing the just transition pillar, which of course is cross-cutting and relates closely to the other two pillars, is I would say in 4 main areas really. First of all, we've been looking at, well, how can we be more strategic, both for ourselves in understanding where the investment opportunities are, what are maybe some of the risks that we need to be aware of, but also how we can work with others to help shape the market for just transition related investing. And so as you just referred to, Nick, we've been working with primarily with TIPS, Saul and Sandy in TIPS in South Africa. We're working with Prasad, also Suranjali at the National Finance Policy Institute, to think about what is needed then, and to develop what we would call roadmaps for financing a just transition, to basically provide that sort of forward look to understand, what is happening both in the policy context, which, we know particularly in South Africa, this is a very advanced policy conversation, but bringing into that the financial considerations and the financial sector, very importantly. And similarly, I think as Prasad said, how we can, as India is now starting to prioritize these issues around just transition, how the financial sector can be very much part of that and help support and engage with particularly policymakers. And of course, recognizing different types of finance, different financial players across the spectrum, with DFIs and MDBs, of course, being very important ones in helping to, as Mafalda just said, actually, just towards the end there, we have a role in being able to, take on more risk, in providing patient capital, and really with our agenda to really crowd in all other financial sector players into these types of investments that are going to be so important to enable the just transition to net zero and climate resilience. So these roadmaps, I would say, are a key part of our sort of more strategic thinking and market shaping activities. But we're also focusing on what we do through our investments directly. And so a big part of this, the way in which we've been thinking about it, and this has sort of emerged through a lot of the conversations we've been having with Saul and others, is we recognize that there's issues around the transition in to the green sectors, if you like, and the opportunities that emerge in that respect, but also the issues around transition out. So as we may be exiting from certain types of investments, how do we engage and look ahead actually to engage with those companies where those economic activities may no longer be viable in the sort of medium and longer term, and how can we do more to engage with our companies in that respect? So in terms of, I would say, just to give you some very specific examples, one really good example of where we first prioritized the focus on just transition in our investments was, is with Ayana Renewable Power, which is an independent solar wind generation company that we developed and launched back in actually 2018. To provide equity investments into green energy infrastructure, into renewable energy, particularly at utility scale. Now, as part of that, over recent years, we with CDC Plus funding, so our equivalent of our technical assistance window, we developed some training programs to upskill local workers, particularly women, into jobs that could bring, quality jobs, some quite technical jobs in relation to operating renewable power stations in Rajasthan. And as part of that, we'd mapped out what the skills gaps were and what kind of training could be provided. We worked closely with DFID, FCDO, on that to ensure that we were really bringing the good quality jobs for the renewable energy sector alongside our investments in through that platform. So this was, I think, a really good example. It also very importantly brings in our strong focus on gender finance and how we can intentionally invest more for gender. And, I think has been very successful. I mean, we've trained hundreds of participants. I think the first batch with around 45 participants, with including quite a few women. And this is now very much part of what we see as needed to enable the transition in to the green economy. As I said, then when we think about the other dimension, what is the transition out? Well, in that respect, we're starting to look at some of the fossil fuel plants we have in our portfolio as we're thinking about exit and decommissioning of some of those that are happening anyway. We're the decommissioning process is how can we engage then with those companies to actually ensure that the employees that may be impacted, and I think importantly, as I think we heard earlier, it's not just those employees inside the particular plant, but actually often a lot of more indirect employment is created. How can we also look to support skilling and other types of training to ensure that those employees can find other jobs, and that may be in the energy sector, it may not. So yeah.
1 minute, please. Thank you.
Okay. I think, well, probably I'll stop there. I mean, there's a lot I'd like to say. I just wanted to reinforce and endorse some of the points that others made, in particular that this is both about the formal but also the informal sector, and a number of issues to think about there. And also, I think the points that Mafalda made, which is, I think, particularly important, particularly for those multilateral development banks that work with governments, that support and work with governments, the more, macroeconomic implications, for example, related to fossil fuel reserves, and others, very interestingly, the example of the Indian railways as well. All of these things need to be integrated and part of what, is ultimately needs to be social, economic, and environmental transition to net zero and climate resilient economies.
Great. Thanks, Amal-Lee. Thanks for rounding us off. I can see that Dipak and Prasad and others have been very busy on the Q&A, answering many of the questions for us. One of the things I got from hearing all of you was a sense of the just transition agenda is not some strange concept, but it actually is core to successful climate action. So that came across very, very clearly. And we've heard particularly about the role of development finance, but I'd really be interested to hear more about the trillions, as it were, to use Jayant's phrase. I mean, what is the appetite from either commercial banks, institutional investors and others to start thinking about not just supporting investing in climate solutions, but maybe to be supporting these just transition solutions as well, both in terms of good green jobs, but also dealing with those workers and communities who are impacted in high carbon areas. We wondered if people have any sort of examples, or particularly where some of the issues are about sort of attracting some of that sort of private capital into this area from some of your work. Any volunteers for this?
So Nick, let me put some of these numbers in context. So if you look at total investment flows into India, typically we are getting FDI of about $60 billion a year. And a lot of that is private equity and venture capital. We are also getting capital flows through the public markets of anywhere from $30 to $50 billion a year. So foreign capital flows into India are about $100 billion a year, and that's financing the growth of the economy and so on. But as I mentioned earlier, that for net zero to happen, incremental investment has to be initially in the next 3, 4, 5 years in the tens of billions of dollars, but it very quickly ramps up to hundreds, if not $200 billion a year in the next 5 years plus. So take all the investments that are happening today, which are about $100 billion a year, and double that, right? That's the kind of trajectory we have to be on in very short order to be able to completely revamp our electricity system, our transportation system, and our other industries. So the scale of the investment flows that we're talking about, it's not about a few $1 billion here and there. It's about hundreds of billions of dollars of capital flows being intermediated through financing institutions that have typically been doing $1 billion a year, $500 million a year. And as I can tell you, somebody who's invested hundreds of millions and billions of dollars a year, even investing that is a real challenge, because you have to find companies that can scale, that have business models that are viable, that have organizations that have the bench strength to absorb that capital, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a very, very difficult task to undertake. And again, as I said, unless we get started right now, this is not going to happen. We'll never be able to scale up fast enough, right? Because every year the challenge becomes more daunting relative to 30 years, 40 years from now. So that's one part of it. The other part, which I will also reiterate what many of my colleagues have said, is the informal sector. If you look at India, whether it's the coal economy, transportation industry, whatever, 80% of India's economic activity or people employed are in the informal sector. We have about 400 million people in our workforce, of which 80 million are in the formal organized economy. 320 million, which includes agriculture, of course, are in the informal sector. So while it's not that hard to be able to reach people in the formal sector and be able to help them make the transition, the folks who are in the informal sector, getting to them and then helping them make the transition, teaching them new skills, equipping them, et cetera, becomes also very, very difficult. And I'm sure that's the case for other developing countries as well, where the formal sector is only 20% of total employment. So these are all, as I said, very daunting challenges. And then let's not minimize the institutional and the governance aspect of it. It's very easy for us to say, okay, let's throw another $10 billion at it. Let's throw another $100 billion at it. But what are the channels through which this is going to go? Are governments equipped to even invest $500 million, $1 billion in a way that is transparent and high integrity and which will meet the ESG norms that any capital provider is going to have? The answer is no. Right? I mean, you just have to come to my home state, in Jharkhand, to see how difficult it is to enable even a primary health center to get built, or a road to get built, or a bridge to get built, because of just the difficulties we have in governance and construction and everything else. Now, to suddenly say, let's scale that up 10x, 100x. Do we have the governance arrangements to absorb that capital, given the governance norms and the integrity standards that exist? No, we don't. So again, the reality of what needs to happen is extremely daunting. And I would welcome any one of you or any one of the people participating to come and join me in Hazaribagh, which is my constituency. I'll be there from the 29th onwards. Please come, I'll take you around and I'll show you what the reality is on the ground on these matters.
Yeah, we need to get to the ground. Dipak, I think you wanted to come in, but particularly, maybe building on what Jayant was saying about some of the practical issues around getting sort of finance involved.
Sure, Nick. I think 100% I agree with Jayant. We undertook a study for the 2017-2018 financial year, in terms of which we looked at, within the nomenclature and within the taxonomy that exists, what climate finance flows look like. And in South Africa, largely because of the private sector driven independent power producer program in renewable energy, we found that based on an offtake, obviously, that Eskom was prepared to enter into, all of these projects have gone through multiple phases of evolution now and de-risking in order to be able to attract the kind of private sector equity, project finance, and commercial loan capital that is available. So I just wanted to make a very simple point, and that is, this is one example of how assistance, in this case through a power purchase agreement, made feasible what was new technology 7 or 8 years ago. And it is now an established industry. It has passed the hurdle of new technology. It is able to provide clean, renewable energy, electricity, through raising capital in the private markets, both domestic and international, both capital and equity. Having said that, I think it's going to be quite important, to Jayant's point as well, to look at what all of the, what I would call destination points for capital look like as it relates to the very complex pathways that we have to undertake. And in this respect, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. Having said that, there is a role for donor as well as DFI financing to come in at an early stage, to come in to close the gap between IRR requirements that the private sector might need, to come in where there's grant components to either result in a lower blended average cost of capital, or indeed to very explicitly fund the kinds of projects that Saul was talking about, which the financial sector, domestic and international, just has no paradigm in terms of which to make those things happen. So there might be some early stage development finance or grant financing that is needed for the financial sector, domestic and international, itself to undergo the kind of transformation that is required to begin to assess risk and to begin to assess desirable outcomes in a slightly different way to that to the traditional historical way in which that was done.
And so from your work, are you seeing sort of appetite from sort of more commercial finance, banks and investors and so on in some of these projects you were talking about?
So we're seeing some appetite for the low risk, high ticket price projects. Those are where the traditional funding arrangements sit. And we're seeing interest in the other types of funding. But as Dipak has said, there isn't the modalities. We don't have some of the finance instruments, and we don't have an ecosystem that enables it. If we look at some of the instruments that I was talking about, we need to start looking at how we bring in different parts of an ecosystem to then support financing for people who haven't been able to access finance in the past, or looking at types of technologies that haven't been funded in the past. So we need to think differently about these things. And it does require everyone to chip in and come in and solve a problem. What is important is that we are seeing the banking sector in South Africa interested in moving in that direction. I think the realization that is, if we don't all start chipping in and changing the world, we're not going to have a world. So it's important that we find a way to get the financial instruments to those who are impacted by climate change and decarbonization, and that we start moving in that direction. And we've been engaging with a number of different players, for example, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, who are looking at these things very seriously, because they need to think about, what is it that we're talking about when companies report on not just climate, but also around the transition. Otherwise, you do risk social unrest when you've got so many people. I think the case of India is important, because so many people are impacted by this. But equally in South Africa, where it's whole towns that are dependent on these types of industries. And it's not just the direct workers, as has been said, it's also the communities, the businesses, and that entire value chain that we see. And Dipak has mentioned, it's not just coal, it's a number of other sectors. It's autos, it's petrochemicals, it's fuel, it's all of those sectors that are seeing some changes occurring. And then the impact of climate change on our agriculture sector, we've already witnessed it. There's been some dramatic climatic events, not only this year, but of the last few years, where South Africa, which is drought prone, is seeing more and more droughts occurring. Before it was once every 10 years. Now we're looking at once every 3 to 4 years, a major drought, which then impacts on a whole range of other people who subsist off agriculture.
Great. And Mafalda, are you finding that to address or to take account of the just transition dimension in your investments, like the accelerating coal phase-out program, that you're needing to think about different instruments and different mechanisms than to speak to sort of Saul's point? What sort of types of mechanisms are you thinking about at the moment when you're sort of approaching the financing of the just transition elements of your work?
Thanks, Nick. I think more than new instruments, I think what's necessary is actually bringing together different instruments into this more programmatic approach. I mean, many of the things that we've heard here today, guarantee mechanisms, you know, senior debt, junior debt, there's a whole variety of instruments and structures that we ourselves have been supporting over the years. I mean, supporting financial intermediaries. We have a large portfolio of supporting financial intermediaries to come in and provide and basically set up credit lines for investments that are climate relevant, but that didn't exist before. And so you create markets because of working with those local commercial institutions. So all of these instruments and approaches, there are approaches in the development community to supporting social development, social protection, community development. There are mechanisms and approaches to supporting governance reform. And we heard one of the panelists, Prasad, mentioned it, DPLs and DPFs. So there's all of these different instruments that are in use and are being used to work with, to tackle different constraints or to tap into different opportunities and address specific risks and constraints. But I think here, what we really need is bringing these things together. So we need to support the regions and the national governments take this broader view, more holistic view about what is the transition, what are the pathways for transition in specific critical sectors, how does that relate to the economy wide, and how do we bring packages of investment and support together, and different instruments that we know and they have been used in the past and have generated results. Mm-hmm. And I think I take the point that Jayant was mentioning, that here we are talking about trillions of dollars that are needed. But this is where this discussion around how does one use public capital and scarce public capital? How does one use scarce public capital to really unlock these much larger flows of private capital? And we need to be quite deliberate on this, to really look carefully at, okay, how have we been deploying public capital, and how do we deploy public capital in the future with a view to tackling these social questions, because these are to a large extent a public mandate. But how do we use this public capital to unlock this private capital? And I think we will need new structures as well. And in the case of South Africa, there are discussions ongoing, and we are part of those discussions on new structures, of thinking of new structures to support the transition. We will need more of those, but it's not like, I also don't want to leave the impression that we need to reinvent the wheel, because that might discourage people that, okay, we are reinventing the wheel. No, these things are known. We just need to bring them together and adjust some approaches that have been used elsewhere to the particular objective we are trying to attain here.
Right. Brilliant. Thank you. We're almost coming up to time, so thanks for the questions that have been in the chat and the Q&A. I'd like to turn to each of you really with a few days left to COP to see what we need to see come out of that, and particularly what do we do to promote a just transition to a climate secure economy in South Africa, India and elsewhere in the developing world from the sort of November the 15th on, after COP. What do we need to be focusing on? Your priorities, your hopes and priorities. And maybe I'll start with you, Amal-Lee, your sort of priorities briefly in terms of what we need to see and what we need to take forward.
Yeah, well, I have quite a long list, but I will just give you maybe my top ones at the moment. So first of all, I mean, obviously it was great that we saw yesterday the delivery plan coming out on the 100 billion. So how developed countries are going to deliver on the 100 billion commitment moving forward, recognizing that it won't be met in 2020. I think as part of that, there is an issue of how to ensure that that is more inclusive as well. Which may be partly to ensure that more finance goes into adaptation, but also I think this agenda as well, and particularly the communities who are impacted, and how do we ensure more inclusive climate finance moving forward. I do also hope that sort of less coming out of, and I think that's part of more than formal process in Glasgow. But I think when we look at all, particularly the first few days when world leaders will be there, and there's going to be a lot of discussions, announcements around how to really ensure that this accelerated coal transition can be supported in a way that delivers a just transition, supports economic development in line with net zero and climate resilient growth for developing countries and emerging markets. And that signals a really renewed commitment for what I believe really needs to be a whole of financial system approach towards what inevitably has to be a whole of economy system transformation, because we need to do more on the public sector side, we need to do more on the private sector side, and across the financial spectrum of the private sector. It's not a case of either or, and it's essential that all of these come together at the country level, at the sector level, at the community level, ultimately. And hopefully coming out of Glasgow, we'll see significant renewed commitment and action towards that.
Great, thank you. Prasad, if I could turn to you for your sort of priorities at COP and looking ahead in terms of the work you're doing on just transition and finance. Can't hear you, unfortunately. You're on mute.
Is
it okay? Yes.
I have a little different viewpoint. While we will see a lot of discussion on how do we engage on just transition. I mean, I'm not saying only developing countries or the developed countries, but as a whole, I would really like to use the word just transformation, which takes me more towards actioning and a much more broader and holistic view. I don't like the term transition, honestly, and I don't see therefore much buying out. It'll be just talking again on the principles, common understanding, definitions, pledging. Well, that's all fine, but I would really like that just transition term goes into transformation. And I think that's where we will see the real change. When you said what's going to be happening on the ground, I think that is how I would look at it, as an opportunity. I'm really more optimistic from that point of view, that we recognize the opportunity for an overhaul, so to say. And this is just a handle to do that.
Thank you. Jayant, to you, your thoughts about priorities into COP and then coming out in terms of taking this agenda forward, including in your constituency.
Well, I'm a politician, and I believe it's important that we have to change the public narrative around climate change. And I reflect on what happened during the COVID pandemic, when epidemiologists since SARS in 2003 have been warning us that a big global pandemic is about to happen, will happen, but nobody really paid attention to it. And we suffered grievously, certainly in human terms and of course in economic terms as well. I think we risk a similar catastrophe with climate change as well. And I can tell you climate change right now in India is probably the 15th or 20th public priority. I don't know what it's like in South Africa. I'd be very interested to hear what my colleagues say. But all the problems we are having with cyclones, with droughts, with flooding, glacial melting, and so on, it's very, very few people who connect the dots and recognize that this is really because the climate is changing, and that we need to, therefore, exactly as Prasad was saying, undertake a very major transformation of the entire economy. This is not some sideshow. This is the main show. But this is not well established in the public awareness or in the political narrative. So I think my most urgent task is to really try and help establish a narrative that we need a whole of the globe, whole of society, whole of government, everybody working together, pitching together to overcome. Otherwise, we are going to face a lot of human suffering and a lot of disastrous consequences, which having gone through the pandemic and other such situations, I at least would like to turn all my attentions and energies to preventing.
Well, all power to your activities there, I think, Jayant. Thank you for that. And Saul, sort of making finance and just transition the main show here. How do you see that going into COP and coming out of COP?
Well, I think we need to see some of these big financial flows translating into funding for projects on the ground and setting up the instruments. I think Mafalda mentioned that the instruments are there. We just need to bring them together to focus on the just transition. So we need to see more of that happening. And we need to see that ecosystem being created around financing of a just transition.
Great. And Mafalda, anything more? We're obviously going to hear a lot from you and the CIFs through COP. You already mentioned a couple of things, but particular things you would like to see coming out of COP on this agenda.
I mean, I echo, I think what Amal-Lee was saying, in the sense that I think one of the good things that will come out of COP26 is this, at least political commitment, not just political. I mean, in our case, we are launching a concrete investment program that will be supporting investments on the ground in 4 countries to begin with: South Africa, India, Philippines, and Indonesia. But, I think from this political commitment to and attention being paid to this part of the energy transition agenda that wasn't really necessarily receiving the due attention before. Because in terms of the energy transition, we can't just focus on new renewable energy capacity. We have to understand that if there's no support to the phasing out from coal and from fossil fuels, we'll not make it. Right. So actually the fact that this is coming out of this COP, I think it's quite important. I think it's quite important that we are seeing increasingly an understanding that climate action and social equity and social inclusion and just transition are 2 sides of the same coin. And so I think this is also something positive that I see. We need more ambition in terms of finance. Everybody recognizes that. But then, I echo the colleagues from India. We need action. That's what we need to focus on, because we are running behind significantly. So we need action. But I also agree with Jayant that it's really important to put the efforts in in creating the narrative. I think, there will have to be different narratives that, that connect to in different countries and different communities, but we need to build that public support to climate action and an understanding why this is not a one country's problem. This is really a global problem, and unless if we come together, we will not make it.
Great. And Dipak, we started with you and your sort of thoughts. And I think you're going to be a COP yourself, but your sort of real hopes and priorities, the things you need to see coming out of COP on this agenda around just transition and finance.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks to the IPCC, there are no debates on the fundamentals of the issues going into COP. Thanks to administrative change in that part of the world that was a behemoth and a drag on the process, hopefully we're not going to see anything similar like that again. What I do hope is continued attention to the fact that there are developing countries which still have to undertake their developmental paths in a new green direction, and in order for them to carve out a set of pathways that, to Prasad's terminology, is a transformative but growing and prosperity generating experience, is what the challenge of the world is. Someone on the chat said developing countries should not aspire to do it the way the United States has done, and I agree with that. There are developmental paths to prosperity that are different, and I think in a cleaner, greener, ecologically friendlier way, we need to find the answer to those development path questions in those countries that still have to undertake that journey.
Well, thanks, Dipak. Thanks for rounding off. Thanks to everyone who's joined this session. Thanks to you, Amal-Lee, to you, Dipak, Jayant, Saul, Mafalda, and Prasad. Lots to take away, but I think really a sense of encouragement and sort of positive momentum here. So thank you all, and hope you join other sessions of the Just Zero conference. So thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you all. Pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.